People are always waxing poetic about how their favorite old games are the best of all time, including myself. One of those games that I'm always hearing about is Parasite Eve, Square Enix's take on a Resident Evil-like franchise that ended on the PSP. But is this game really still good or even worth playing? I was determined to find out after there were so many suggestions and comments about it. Seems this game has some serious love. So I bought the original PS1 version of this game because I'm an insane person, dusted off the old PS2, and booted up the ROM on my Steam Deck because I don't have time to sit in front of my TV anymore. But first, I want to get a better idea of what people had to say about this with those nostalgia glasses on. But before we get into it, if you're a fan of retro games with a major dose of RPGs and nostalgia, then why don't you entice your subscribe button with the promise of an RPG only to rip the rug out from under it, revealing that it's actually a horror game. And also don't forget to like and hit that notification bell. All right, let's get into it. All right, so I decided to ask why my friends like Parasite Eve so much and why they would recommend it. So, why do you like Parasite Eve so much? I don't have any friends. So I went to the internet. And what I found was very interesting. Now, before I get into what Twitter had to say, always fun to do, context is super important for these games. This game came out in the States in 1998 and has a wild history due to the fact that this era of Squaresoft development is considered by most to be the most experimental. During the development of Final Fantasy VII, Hironobu Sakaguchi originally conceived the idea of a game with a detective mystery set in New York, where reactors would blow up and old Detective Joe would need to find the infamous group blowing him up. While some of these concepts were kept for Final Fantasy VII, many of them eventually carried over to a new game based on the book and film called Parasite Eve in Japan. This game would actually be a sequel of sorts to the film, and it's set in New York versus Tokyo, and would explore a more cinematic gameplay experience following the character Aya Brea. Here, there would be an outbreak of these evolved and rebellious mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, led by Eve. And Eve would go to, start setting people on fire, turning them into goo or other nasty things, while animals become deformed monsters. And this crazy situation causes an evacuation of New York City, leaving Aya and crew to search the creepy and empty streets of Manhattan. This is all, of course, a very interesting setup, but what did people have to say about it? Well, mostly that this is a hidden gem, often overlooked, and it's many people's favorite PS1 game of all time. Aya is cited as being one of the coolest female protagonists. The exploration is touted as being creepy, feeling like Resident Evil in the best way. The combat system is talked about as being a satisfying take on an action turn-based gameplay. And the story? Well, this one's more of a mixed bag. Some people loved it, while other people think it's one of the weakest elements of the game. And you have to remember, 1998 was huge for gaming. Parasite Eve was surrounded by games like Resident Evil 2, Final Fantasy Tactics, Xenogears, the introduction of Crash Bandicoot, Spyro, Banjo-Kazooie, as well as other massive Nintendo games like Zelda Ocarina of Time and even Pokemon Red and Blue. So the fact that people speak so highly of this game amidst its competition is pretty impressive. And all this definitely piqued my interest. I'm not much into horror games personally, but this looks like a gem that I need to check out. So I set out to play this roughly 10-hour game, and this is my experience. Play you some Parasite Eve, gotta feed the cats first. It's gonna be awesome. Nope. When I started the game, I couldn't help but get a sense that this is almost like a Final Fantasy VII multiverse situation. While I know it's technically not intended that way, it's hard not to make the comparisons. But the hook in this game is strong and more intense than I expected. Aya Brea, who is a rookie NYPD officer, starts her journey by going on a date with some no-name dude to an opera at Carnegie Hall. And during the opera, we're introduced right out the gate to Eve, whose singing triggers something in people who slowly overheat and set on fire. Everybody, except Aya, who quickly rushes the stage to confront this unknown villain, and yet Eve knows her. Then shortly after chasing Eve down and being confronted with this strange sense of familiarity, along with seeing shadows of a young girl wandering around, all of which unravels later in the story, she leaves the opera house to be cornered by a reporter who strongly implies that the cause of all this must have been her, since she was the only survivor. To which her NYPD partner, Daniel, steps up and slugs the guy and gets Aya right out of there. What a setup. And this intro further solidified the comparisons for me. Aya Brea feels kind of like a female Cloud from another universe. She's quiet, broody, has a mysterious background, and she keeps having flashbacks. She's the one who runs up to Eve when everyone's screaming. She may not have a buster sword, but she busts out that gun real fast. And Daniel? Let's see, this guy has a strong sense of justice throughout the story, a child that he will do anything to protect. He loses his wife in a freak situation with Eve. He also has a gun. I don't know. Sound familiar? And Kunihiko Maeda, the Japanese scientist, he's obviously... Okay, I got nothing on him. So I guess the comparisons can only be pushed so far. But it's definitely there, and it makes sense given the development history. There are a lot of other side characters, but Aya, Daniel, and Maeda are what pushed the plot forward. And Maeda's introduction comes with context of what happened in Japan. And speaking of comparisons, one of the latter incarnations of Eve looks awfully familiar. Some of the plot is centered around chasing Eve, trying to stop her from succeeding in her mission, and saving remaining survivors in the city. And the map was pretty straightforward. You have the larger Manhattan map, and you go to individual locations in New York, like the Museum of Natural History, Central Park, the St. Francis Hospital, the Statue of Liberty, and eventually the Chrysler Building, where you will access the true final boss after beating the game once. And not only should you not miss that ending, but I've heard that it actually gives context to Parasite Eve 2 as well. And if you look closely, there are some fun little Final Fantasy references, like the chocobo on the museum icon on the map. This kind of level setup felt fine to play through, as each location had a meaningful enough map size, and that the game still felt large with lots to explore, and it kept the atmosphere dark and creepy and quiet, especially with that music from Yoko Shimomura. The soundtrack makes this game downright unsettling. Night? You can call me Parasite Eve, and I've come for you. While I haven't played much of Resident Evil besides some earlier run-ins with the older games at some friend houses when I was a kid, I can see why this kind of atmosphere is compared so strongly. Most locations are dark, sometimes they'll have electrical issues, creepy side rooms, enemies that jump out, unsettling music, and these big mutated bosses. The only main difference from my understanding is the combat system. And the combat system was what I could see as being hit or miss for someone by today's standards. While it's not bad, I found myself wanting more from movement and the ability to dodge enemy attacks. In some cases, bigger battles were spent trying to get some good hits in and just healing to survive, and the random-ish battles could be a bit annoying, especially as I was backtracking at times after exploring one area that was off the beaten path. But let me back up first and explain how this all works. First, in any of the locations, there are these hotspots where you're likely to run into an enemy, so it's not exactly random encounters. You definitely get a feel for when it's going to happen. It's just not really avoidable like random encounters aren't. Anyway, when you get into the battles, you essentially enter a limited arena where Aya can move around and shoot or hit enemies with a gun or a baton. This is technically a turn-based system where there is an active time bar that goes between each attack. Movement didn't do as much for me as I was hoping, because you still get hit a lot in this game. But positioning can mean you evade and will affect damage as well, depending on what weapon you're using. Aya also has parasite energy, which is explained over the course of the plot, but essentially allows her to use magic. And this wasn't super clear to me at first, because while I kept seeing notices of getting new powers, I didn't realize that you had to open the menu to use it every time, which felt a bit clunky. I actually discovered it by accident when I was trying to heal with an item, and I went, oh, I can heal! To be fair, I could have just missed it being stated somewhere, and I'm just the dum-dum. As a side note, I did love those Final Fantasy VIII sound effects, though, when you heal. Nice one, Square. And speaking of items, this game has an inventory management system similar to what I've seen in Resident Evil games, or even some of the Deus Ex games. It was fine, but man, could it be a pain in the butt when you got things like keys for doors that weren't a one-time use. You'll get healing items, status healing items, weapons, and tools to merge weapons, as well as their skills eventually. And with each bonus points you get from leveling up, you can choose to upgrade your slots or your speed. So it ends up being pretty fun to figure out.
And I didn't catch this till after I beat the game, but don't get rid of that junk that's in your inventory. Hand it over to Wayne, and after about 300 pieces, I think you can use it for some of the ultimate gear.
With all this, I did have a pretty fun time, though the age can be felt. This game could benefit immensely from a remaster or remake, but I can't say the issues took me out of the experience. I still really enjoyed progressing, building up my weapon setup, upgrading my armor, and even the battle system despite the pain of running around desperately healing and trying to avoid getting hit in some battles. It was still fun. And honestly, many of the aged mechanics didn't actually feel as detrimental because the story did keep me moving along. Now, I do have a lot to critique about this story, but I can't deny that the pacing and the intrigue absolutely kept me hooked and interested throughout the entire game. I won't go into too much spoiler territory here, but I'll let you know when I'm about to use an example that will reference latter game information if you'd rather not know. First, the good. As I mentioned before, the mystery behind Aya Brea has the same hook as the flashbacks in Final Fantasy VII or even Final Fantasy VIII, which I loved. I don't care what they say. The flashbacks and the ghostly character Aya keeps seeing and how it all relates to her place in the story was super interesting, and they drip feed you information just enough to make you want to keep going. I felt more like I was addicted to the mystery than I was about stopping Eve, though obviously she is a very killable villain, so that wasn't not there. And the characters grow together and become what feels like a family, culminating in characters like Daniel throwing himself into harm's way with some crazy stunts to take care of Aya and those he loves. So while we don't get a ton of time with them, the time you do is enough to endear you to the cast, especially Maida. When introduced, he seems kind of like a nobody, kind of strange, but by the end, he is absolutely one of the crew and has clearly demonstrated his own willingness to be in harm's way for the sake of his friends. Though I did enjoy the story overall, there is some plot jankiness that I probably would have missed had I played this as a kid that was odd. Some of this may be considered hard spoiler, but I'll do my best to give the high level in case you want to enjoy this yourself. And if you want to avoid this entirely, then jump to the timestamp on the screen. And here we go. So first, the defense capabilities of these mitochondria creatures makes zero sense. Aya comes in with a pistol or other guns, I suppose, maybe even a police beating stick, and you can take down these monsters. Military comes in with guns? Nah, bro, you dead. You even have moments where there are literal jets and helicopters with missiles, and they're just brushed off, with the vehicles usually blowing up. But when Aya faces off the final boss, a stick or some bullets will do the trick.
To be fair, they're special bullets.
I get why she can go into areas alone because she can withstand overheating and that kind of thing, but how do these weapons actually work? Don't know. And some of the latter revelations feel really anticlimactic. You essentially learn of this evolved mitochondria's place in human history, how essentially they've used humans to expand so they can take over and, I don't know, become human for reasons. So this kind of destroys any critique that they have about humanity in the story. You're basically like, we made you do it. We need to replace you to do the same thing. I don't know, maybe there's something I missed that makes this make sense. Let me know if I'm missing something here in the comment section below. Some of this just left me with a sense of confusion at the end, like, are we the good guys here? Most JRPGs are like, humans have been bad, but we can do better. And setting aside the consistency of many of those stories, I feel like we don't really even get that. It was just, you suck, and you're the real parasites on the planet, and you cause chaos. Oh look, Christmas Eve again. But anyway, With all of that said, I really did enjoy my time with this game, and I can totally see how this would stand among many of those other PS1 RPGs that are considered great, because this one is certainly one of the most interesting. This is really all you wanted? Of course, you ridiculous human. This is all we ever want, mitochondria included. So I give Parasite Eve the honorary retro quality seal of approval. It was still fun. And this game is a very unique experience, and I love that it's a pretty tight 10-hour experience. It is ripe for a remake though. But even as it stands, I'd recommend checking it out if you're interested in what equates to a Final Fantasy Resident Evil game. And the second one may even be better, which I plan to check out sometime in the near future. Comment with what retro games you'd like to see me try out and give the old nostalgia challenge. Subscribe for more, and thanks for watching. I'll see ya.